This is aimed at, you know, people that are relatively new to shooting, and they've looked at scope rails and scope mounts and the many different types and have got a bit confused. Hopefully this will be a basic explanation as to what's what. So what is a scope rail? A scope rail is a part of your gun's action, usually the top of the action, that is a mechanism for attaching a scope. So the scope needs to be securely attached. And there are different types. We'll get onto that in a minute. What is a scope mount? So a scope mount, and there are many different types, is the mechanism for attaching the scope, the actual scope, to the rail on the gun. So it's your connection method. And again, there are different types. We'll look at those in a minute. So the different types of scope rail are basically, you've got dovetail, you've got weaver, you've got Picatinny, and there is actually a fourth that some people don't know about, which is called NATO. NATO and Picatinny are pretty much 100% compatible. Weaver has slightly narrower slots. This is a weaver rail, so as you can see, it's got slots going across it. And the Picatinny and NATO sizes of these slots are pretty much the same. Weaver are slightly narrower. So if you've got a Picatinny mount and you're trying to attach it, the slots on the Picatinny will be slightly too big because these are narrow on the weaver. They sometimes fit, but they sometimes don't. So if you want the best compatibility and you're going with a weaver or a Picatinny or a NATO rail, go with Picatinny because it pretty much matches everything. Dovetail is along the top of the action. There are two horizontal slots that are cut into the top of the action, two grooves, and the mount, I'll show you this one on the back of my hand, trying to get that so you can see it. So these two bottom grips, if you like, grip the dovetail rails on your gun. So basically you've got the slot system, which is weaver or Picatinny or NATO, and you've got the groove system, which is dovetail. What is a scope mount? So a scope mount is the actual device that connects from the rail on your gun to the scope. So as you can see on here, this is my Virarc 97. We've got a scope mounted, and obviously we've got two. This is a one-piece mount with two straps, and these are called double straps because they've got two screws. Sometimes you get a thinner strap which has only got one screw. It's called a single strap. Double strap means it's gripping the scope more securely. Single straps are a bit thinner, so they're obviously not gripping it more securely. So yeah, so a scope mount is literally that, to enable you to mount your scope onto the gun. And again, there are different types. There are lots of different manufacturers. I've got some BKL ones here. I've got some Wolf ones. I've got some Sports Match. You can also get Hawk. There's a company called Tier 1, which are very expensive. You've got Burris. There's lots of different manufacturers, but they're all basically a clamp that clamps your scope to the scope rail. Now for springers, you get more recoil. With a PCP, you get very little recoil. So for springers, you can get what's called scope creep, i.e. the scope, as you fire the gun and the gun recoils, and obviously with a springer you get more recoil than on a PCP, it's basically shaking the scope backwards and forwards, and over time the scope can generally, it'll move backwards. It'll slowly move backwards and it will affect your zero. You'll find the gun's not as accurate. So the way to combat that is, generally with a springer, you want a one-piece mount. So if I show you, these are what's called two-piece mounts. So you've literally got two pieces, one on the front of the scope, one on the rear. But if you look at the length of that, so that length there is the surface area that's gripping the scope rail. So if I compare that to a one-piece mount, you can see the length for this one-piece mount that's actually gripping the scope rail is much greater. So this has got a much greater surface area to grip the rail, therefore it's much more secure, much less likely to slide backwards or forwards. So with a springer, one-piece mounts are generally recommended over two-piece mounts. Now you can also get what's called single strap and double strap, which I mentioned on my Varrock. So again, these are double strap. They've got 2 screws and they're quite thick. The actual ring that goes around the scope. These are double strap, 2 screws, quite thick. You can get single strap. Actually, here's a single strap here. So this is called a single strap because it's only got 1 screw. Generally, double straps, again, they give you a greater surface area to grip the scope. So generally, they're better than a single strap. For PCPs, it's not such an issue whether you use 1-piece or 2-piece mounts or single or double strap mounts, because you get much less recoil. So the chance of the scope actually moving is much less. You can also get adjustable scope mounts. If I just pull up here, I've got a web page here. Hopefully you can see that. So you can get adjustable. You can buy them. They're a bit more expensive than normal mounts, but they allow you to adjust. So if you're in a situation where you can't zero your scope, using it, you've run out of windage or elevation, you can use an adjustable scope mount to give you more windage or more elevation. Generally, I've been shooting for 40 years. I've never run out of elevation on a scope and had to shim a scope. Generally, if there's a problem with the scope and you can't zero it, you can't get it accurate, it's normally because the scope hasn't been set up right, or the mounts haven't been set up right. The mounts are not sitting on the rail correctly, or the scope rail is slightly out of alignment with the action. It hasn't been machined in correctly in 100% alignment, or you've got a slightly bent barrel. I mean, if you think about it, scopes have got quite a lot of adjustment. So for it to run out of windage or elevation, there's got to be something quite fundamental wrong with the setup. As I say, I've never had to use a shim or an adjustable mount because I've always found that the problem is something else. But in the rare case where you have got a scope rail that's out of alignment or a bent barrel, then yes, you can use an adjustable mount. You can also get what's called quick release mounts. Whoop, knocking my camera. So if you look at these, they have Allen key. You put an Allen key in there to tighten them up and loosen them, and then obviously you put Allen key in the top to tighten them down onto your scope. But you can get, this is actually off a red dot. This is a mount for a mounting rail for a red dot scope, and these are sort of basically thumb turn screws. You can put they are slotted, you can put a big screwdriver in, but you can also just do them up with your hand. And you can buy what are called quick release clamps. So again, I've got up on the website here. Quick release, so basically rather than using an Allen key to mount the mount to the scope rail, you just flip that little lever and it tightens it and loosens it just with the flip of a lever. So again, it just makes it that little bit easier. What else do I need to talk about? Some guns do have dual rails. Most guns will just have 1 rail. They'll either have Picatinny and Weaver, or they'll have a dovetail. Some guns, I've actually got a Crow, and it does have a dual rail. It has dovetail, and then on top of the dovetail, it's got Weaver slots. So you can actually use both. Now, advantages and disadvantages of the mounts and the rails. With dovetail, you can get them mounted incorrectly. So I'm going to try and show you this. I'm not sure if it's going to come up, but so here we got a dovetail mount, and as you can see, it's got this side plate here. Now this can be turned 2 different ways, because generally these are 2 sizes. These will fit a 9mm and an 11mm dovetail. I need to mention at this point that BSA are famous for having a 13mm dovetail. So if you've got a BSA, generally you need to buy a 13mm specific mount for it. But most other guns are either 9mm or 11mm, and how you decide how you decide to get this mount clamped properly is you flip that over, that little side plate. So I've got one here where I've taken it off. So you can see I've taken I've got the side plate here, and I've taken it off. So if you put it one way, hopefully you can see that this has actually got the big notch at the bottom, so that'll be a 9mm rail. So if you had an 11mm, you literally swap this round and put it on like that, and now you've got the smaller one at the bottom, and that will be an 11mm rail. The mistake a lot of people make is they don't even realise that it's two sizes, and they maybe put this on when it's set up for 11mm on a 9mm clamp, or the other way around, they put it up set up for 9mm on an 11mm rail. So you need to make sure that your side plate is the correct way round for whatever size rail you've got, 9mm or 11mm. The other thing to remember is when you put your clamps on the gun, make sure it's actually seated correctly. Now I'm going to try and show you this, but the light in my garage is not the best in the world. I'm going to try and see if we can pick it up. Let's try and get my camera down now. See if we can see it. I might even try and zoom in a bit. Whoop. Right, so there you can see. Put my finger there you can see. You want the gap to be equal all the way round. I'm trying to show you that. You can't really see it. Ah, there you go. That's a better picture. Right. So you see the gaps on both sides is pretty much the same. So anyway, I think you get the picture. You basically need, when you put the mounts on the gun, whoop, the camera back up. Yeah, when you get the mounts on the gun, make sure you've got those side plates the right way around and it's on centered. The scope is not leaning one way or leaning the other. I know mine looked like it was leaning a little bit because I've got the gun slightly canted over in the mount. It's not because the scope is canted over. Yeah, so make sure that if it's 9mm rail or 11mm rail, you've got the side plates on the right way around. The other thing is you can get self-centering mounts. So I've got some here. I've got some BKLs. So if you look at the BKL, when compared to, they haven't got the side plate. So basically you turn this Allen key and it will widen these two clamps, and you put it on the rail and then you tighten that Allen key up again and it will close those clamps. But because they're equally spaced, it's self-centering, so you cannot, you know, provided you've got both of these grooves in the grooves, it cannot, you know, you can't install it incorrectly. It will be centered properly. These are slightly more expensive BKLs. Burris also do self-centering scope mounts. They tend, as I said, a little bit more expensive, but they eliminate that risk of you not using the side plates correctly. And the side plates can sometimes pull the scope slightly to one side and introduce a little bit of cant. They can do if you don't know what you're doing, you've done it incorrectly. Recoil, yeah. So in most scope mounts, you've got a recoil pin. So see there's a little pin that sticks out. And in most actions, you've got a couple, normally you've got 2 or 3 holes drilled in the top. So when you put your mount on, this recoil pin will actually sit in one of those holes. So if you get recoil, it stops it moving because the pin is in the hole in the action, it cannot move. So for springers where you got a lot of recoil, it's a good idea to use the recoil pin in one of the holes if you've got them. Not every gun has the recoil or sort of scope arrestor holes, but if you've got one and you've got a pin in your scope mount, use it. It will eliminate any scope creep and damaging your scope rail or your scope or your mount. We've talked about one piece having a greater surface area to grip the rail rather than 2-piece. We've talked about single and double straps. So what are advantages and disadvantages? So dovetail mounts obviously can move. They can be a bit fiddly to fit because of all the things I've said about the side plates, making sure you've got them centered properly. They can be fiddly to fit, but once you've done them 2 or 3 times, it's easy. I'm slowly going over to self-centering BKL mounts, but I've still got some guns with side plate dovetails on them. Picatinny and Weaver rails generally are easier and quicker to fit, and it reduces the chance of scope creep, because if you think about it, on a Weaver or a Picatinny rail, because you've got these grooves, the scope, if you look at these scopes, so they've got this bar across the bottom here. That bar sits inside one of these grooves, so it's a bit like a scope arrestor or stop pin. Once that mount is mounted in the rail and your bar is in one of those slots, it can't move forward or backwards. So generally they're easier to fit, quicker to fit, and you can get a more consistent and repeatable scope position. If you know you've got your rear scope mount on the third slot back from here, you can take your scope off, do a bit of servicing or whatever, and as long as you know that you've put your scope mount back on the third slot, it will be in exactly the same place that it was when you took it off. With a dovetail, you've got to either mark, put a bit of masking tape or something on the scope rail if you want to try and get it back in exactly the same position. So it's just a bit more of a faff. With your mounts, as I said, the disadvantage is you've got the side plates with the dovetail mounts. You can put them on incorrectly. You can put them on with you can sometimes misalign them so they're not sitting on the scope rail centered 100%. Whereas with BKL or Burris, the self-centering dovetail mounts, they're the clue's in the name. They're self-centering, so you're generally going to eliminate cant. Cant, if you don't know, is where you've got some horizontal movement in the point of impact. So wherever the point of aim is, the pellets are going slightly left or right. That's generally cant. It's where the scope isn't 100% lined up with the barrel or the action or the point of aim. And again, that can be because of the way the scope's mounted. So self-centering mounts can eliminate that. So I've got my Reximex here, which has got the Weaver rail on it. So again, there you can see, and these are actually quick release. Rather than using an Allen key, you can actually turn these with your hand. I've nipped them up with a spanner just to make sure they're tight, but you can see you've got your slots there. So once the thin pin that's at the bottom of that mount is in one of these slots, it can't go backwards or forwards anywhere. You'll also note that these are triple. I've talked about single and triple strap. These are actually triple strap. They just happen to be the ones that came with this scope. But again, you've got a bit more security. It's gripping a slightly larger area of the scope there. So again, this is a PCP, so recoil isn't an issue, but you can get singles, doubles, and even triples. This particular gun has actually got an adjustable rail. So around the other side of the gun, there's two Allen keys, and you can actually lift the rail up. You can lift it up at the front or rear. So again, if you ever did run out of elevation, you can actually adjust this rail, which is quite a neat feature. I've not seen on any other guns before. So there you go. There's a brief overview description of various gun scope rails and gun scope mounts. I hope that's explained the differences a little bit.